you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. I want to remind you that we have been broadcasting this show, Living in Mexico, since 2004. So I really appreciate all of you who've been joining us throughout the years. And now we are broadcasting live via YouTube. We're streaming live via YouTube on my YouTube channel. So you'll have the opportunity to see this and listen to this interview later on if you couldn't join us on my radio show. If you've been following the news, there is protests continue to take place in Mexico. And what's interesting is that these protests have, there's different reasons, there's different people protesting. The government reacts differently to these protests depending who's on the streets and their resources. Well, the protests that we were following very closely this week, and I must remind you, we're less than, I don't know, we're about 60 days away from the first, the inaugural game for the World Cup here in Mexico. In fact, as you know, the president, Claudia Sheinbaum, was in Washington for this the raffle to understand what countries are going to be playing in what whether in Canada, United States, or Mexico. But this is moving very fast. But there are these protests that are taking place, and the issue is, will they continue, or will they use the World Cup as a way of pressuring the government? Well, this week's protest had to do with farmers and cattle people who drove tractors to Mexico City, and they did block the entrance. They were protesting the general water law that was being discussed and eventually was approved by the lower house. They argued that the reform would restrict water use in rural areas, reallocating it and making the federal government who would control, and they believe that the fact that this control by the federal government is a threat to their livelihood. Farmers also saw that, or at least argued that the law undermines their fundamental rights to water, and the reform would end the ability to transfer, this is what the farmers are saying, to transfer or sell water concessions between private individuals, limiting, for example, inheritance or property rights. So the law was approved, and the farmers and the cattle, because this is both farmers and cattlemen, cattle people, the cattle industry are very, very concerned about this. To talk about the implications of this law and the tensions that are being created and the impact this could have on the country in the next couple of weeks. Joining us today once again is Oscar Serrato. He's a political analyst. He's up in he's an expert on some water rights and Oscar, I'm trying to understand. You're up in the northern part of the country. You're in the state of Sonora right now, which, of course, water rights is very, very important, considering that the big percent of Sonora is the desert. But water rights in general are important for certain industries. So just walk us through what do those who are protesting, do they have are their conclusions about this law correct? Why are they so willing to go out and protest and confront the government? Welcome to the show.
Okay, thank you very much for having me, and it's a pleasure to talk to you. And at this time, they have all the reasons to be worried, and they have all the reasons to protest against this law. This law, in less than 40 hours, went through Congress, the deputies, and the Senate. The Senate even the two chambers. The Senate didn't even bother to read what was voting, because it's impossible to understand the document in the fast track that they did.
Wow.
This is a paradigm shift. In Mexico, let's backtrack. In 2012, changed its constitution to enact water rights as a human right. And it said back then in 2012, in less than 1 year, a new water law should be enacted. was never enacted. Peña Nieto didn't do anything. López Obrador didn't do anything. What we have now, it's one piece of new legislation, a Ley General de Aguas Nacionales, a new general law for water, and a reform to the existing Ley de Aguas Nacionales. The thing that it has everyone worried is the reform of Ley de Aguas Nacionales. This law restricts movement of water rights from one individual to another. It has an Article 22 which states los derechos amparados en las concesiones y asignaciones no serán objetos de transmisión. It means that water rights that have been assigned or are part of a concession, a water title, cannot be transferred, period. And then it says, in the cases of hereditary rights and all other cases, according to what it stated in another article of this law.
Right.
That phrase that they cannot be transmitted, it's a paradigm shift. It means that the water rights, which are part of the balance sheet of most companies and are part of the land
Value.
it,
The value of the
it's a
land
value.
depends whether you have water or not.
To put it into context of the US law, this is a taking. They're taking away some value, someone that is worth something from the people, and transferring back to the government.
Right.
What we had before this is a market-based solution where water could be transferred like a commodity. Now, that commodity, which is water, cannot be transferred because the government is taking all the rights and said, I will distribute it again among the people as I see fit. The first priority is human consumption. And to put it into context, most of the water in this country and everywhere else is just for agriculture. Then
For
you
agriculture.
have the mining industry, which is water intensive, and then you have energy production, and then you have cattle ranches, which are
But where does human consumption go into this?
human consumption. What we expected in this law that has been waiting for 12 years is the human water. We have a crisis in the way the water companies, which are owned by the counties or the municipios in this country, because Article 150 of the Constitution says that counties are supposed to be in charge of water. They're a mess. Most of them are.
So this law doesn't affect human consumption. I mean, there's other issues that
Yes,
to be resolved in order to assure human consumption, clean water for human consumption.
This law doesn't affect human consumption. It's supposed to protect human consumption, but it does not enter into the way water is distributed among the houses. It affects mostly, it's a value taking that the net worth of the land is shifted because water rights in Mexico are not attached to the land. The land is a separate property than the water rights. And before this, they could be transferred, sold, given to another individual together. Now you can sell the land and you have to ask the government, which will decide under its own discretion with rules that are not clear in this law, that if they want to transfer, they allow the transfer of water rights between individuals, corporations. We're moving from a market-based system with that institutional framework that assures water
Right.
rights, a
Mhm.
discretionary system that whoever is in charge is going to decide whatever they want, and
Right.
the appeal process is not very well specified. It also creates a list of crimes with
Wow.
water, which is the big stick.
So that you can be prosecuted. Criminal prosecution could go to jail if you are using water that the government perceives is you do not have that right. Now let me ask you this. I mean, one of the arguments joining us today, by the way, is Oscar Serrato. We're talking about this new water law that was approved both by the lower house and the Senate. It's has mobilized different sectors of and different industries around the country, but particularly agricultural, cattle, and in general, industries that have one way or the other depend on the access to water. Now, let me ask you this. The government has argued that there was basically that the water was used incorrectly and that you would have people that would have these wells and they would sell water to the municipalities making a lot of money, so that the concessions that they believe should be for the land or to be used in your for cattle, or for wheat or whatever crop you have, that it was being used for other things, and that the law allowed that, and that this was not fair. So that's, I believe, is one of the main arguments that the government is laying down on the table. Do you agree with that?
Well, you can always pick in the 300,000 concessions of water some cases where they're being abused,
Abuse. There was abuse. Right.
where they're being misused. You have
Mhm.
some water rights that are supposed to be for agriculture that are
Mhm.
irrigating golf,
Right.
and that's an abuse.
Mhm.
But that's the least of the cases when most of the water it's used by agriculture for agricultural purposes
Mhm.
and correct purposes. If you have one apple, you're not going to throw away the entire system and
Mhm.
say, I'm going to take care of all the apples and I will hand them out
Okay.
as I
So,
please,
mhm.
because that leads, whenever you give discretion to an individual, you will
Mhm.
have political power, will have corruption, and
Mhm.
you will have inefficiencies.
Right. Well, then I guess, and I really appreciate you joining us today, Oscar. Then I guess let's start looking towards the future. I mean, clearly the law has been passed. The those who are protesting against this legislation are a group of people that normally that they used to protest. Farmers used to protest a lot. Um, in other during other administrations, I think it kind of went down or was reduced in the last during President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. But now it seems that there is a group of these people that are willing to go out and protest. And in some parts of the country, you can't. In the northern part of the country, there's some places where you can't cross into the United States, or they're starting to block main highways. We felt some of it here in Mexico City, but my understanding is that in other parts of the country, these protests are actually becoming a major issue for mobilizing people, or for people to move around. Do you think what's going to happen with these protests?
Well, these protests will keep going on because we have a crisis in the agricultural sector.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it, it's we don't have enough water.
Mm-hmm.
The prices of commodities are governed by a worldwide market, and corn, wheat are not as valuable as they were because bumper crops in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a dual crisis for the agricultural sector in terms of the northern part, which is corn and wheat, because the
Mm-hmm.
prices are not enough and there is not enough water. In other places of Mexico, the agriculture sector, they may have water, but they do not have the security to harvest their
Mm-hmm.
crops and take them to market, or they have to pay taxes to organize crime. So the agricultural sector, it's in a crisis. And
Right.
the worst thing that they can do right now is do a taking and reduce the value of their land holdings because they're essentially expropriating
Mm-hmm.
something from value that they own now, and they are taking the value that they have. Their net
Mm-hmm.
worth is being reduced because that valuable asset that they had, water, which they can sell along with the land, it's now back in the discretion of a bureaucrat that may or may not be as efficient, but will not. We're destroying the institutional framework that was operating the water sector for the last 20 years. We're
Wow.
going back to a discretionary system.
Mm-hmm.
And the agricultural sector, it's viewed very differently from Mexico City because people in Mexico City tend to think that oranges grow on the supermarket.
Right. Yeah, they
Oranges,
don't understand. Yeah. Yeah.
oranges
Yeah.
actually grow on trees, and
Mm-hmm.
that might come as a shock to some of the bureaucrats or even the president who
So
has
you
never
do
had a
think the
contact with the
protests,
agricultural sector. The
so
process will continue.
yeah, the protests will continue. Well, we're gonna have to watch it very, very closely. I'm just, we're talking a lot how what's going to be happening politically in Mexico in the next couple of weeks, as we get closer and closer to the World Cup. Um, Thank you so much for joining us, Oscar Serrato. He's joining us from Hermosillo, Sonora. Thank you so much for joining us here on Living in Mexico.